We all know that family law cases can be complicated, which is why you and your client deserve reliable, hassle-free drug and alcohol testing services. From hair testing to abstinence monitoring, we can help. Visit lextalks.co.uk for more information.
You're listening to the Today's Family Lawyer podcast, the leading source of daily news and insight for family law practitioners in England and Wales. Sign up to our free weekly newsletter at todaysfamilylawyer.co.uk and subscribe to hear all the latest news and views from across the family law sector. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello, welcome along to the latest Today's Family Lawyer podcast. Today I am delighted to welcome Annmarie Carvalho, Director of TCC. You'll explain that much better than I will, Annmarie. A reformed solicitor. You describe it as a former solicitor. I'm going to call it a reformed solicitor in family law. We're talking about a new book that you've published, which we'll dive into and explore. But thank you so much for joining the podcast. In the first instance, I like to get a bit of a feel for the people that we get onto the podcast. So tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do. What is TCC?
Thanks, David. It's nice to be here. So I was a family solicitor and mediator at Farrers, a central London law firm, for over 10 years. While I was there, I began retraining to become a therapist because I realised that the thing that really fascinated me about being a family lawyer was the personal relationships and the psychology of what was going on. So I, 7 years ago, set up my agency TCC, which stands for the Carvalho Consultancy, but also training, coaching and counselling, which is what we provide. So most of us are former lawyers who have retrained as coaches, trainers and therapists. We've all worked in professional services to a very high level, and we provide training, therapy, counselling, business support primarily to law firms and barristers' chambers. And our motto is "Because we've walked in your shoes," which reflects my belief that the best person to support somebody is someone who's done the job themselves and understands the particular stresses and strains.
Your book is rather aptly called Staying Sane in Family Law. I guess in the first instance, tell us about what TCC does, how it supports law firm professionals, because that's your target market, isn't it? People who work in and around family law, not actual end users particularly.
I guess it evolved naturally. So when the pandemic came along, my business had been running for 18 months. And at that time, I was seeing mainly divorcing clients and users of the family law process. But what I realised quite quickly as the pandemic started, and that sort of terrible time we all lived through, is more and more I was getting lawyer clients. And that's evolved, over the past 7 years. So now we work with lawyers and professionals from across the spectrum of different practice areas. But we do have this strong foundation within the family law world. We provide bespoke training for lawyers in how to work in a more psychologically informed way. So we provide training on working well with people with mental health disorders, working with vulnerability and suicidality. We're becoming a trauma-informed lawyer, working with resistance well. So it's all about trying to infuse the legal world and the professional world with these tips and techniques from the therapeutic world that when I was doing my therapy training, I was sat there thinking, oh my God, this would be really useful for lawyers to know, coming away with practical tips for how to work well with resistance or vulnerability or whatever it might be. So these are practical ideas, but they come from the world of therapy and they're really useful in my experience, and we get great feedback for our training. We also provide one-on-one therapy, couples therapy, therapeutic supervision, which is something that's become very popular within the family law world in particular. So we support the legal world in lots of different ways.
I guess that people who come to you directly for this sort of training are going to be very receptive to your messaging. But in general, is the family law community receptive to this kind of training? And do they want to be trained in all of these different sort of therapeutic skills when in actual fact they are lawyers and their role really is the legal process of whatever it is that they've been instructed to do?
It's a really interesting question, actually. So I find that the family law world is in general very receptive to this sort of training. In fact, I would say they've been crying out for this sort of training. And things have evolved in the 7 years that I've been delivering this training. So more and more it's snowballed. In the early days, we would get a lot of interest from younger practitioners who just had a feeling that they wanted to work in a more psychologically informed way. They knew that when they were working with, let's say, a very high stress, high octane, highly contentious divorce, that their legal skills, the skills that they learned in law school, were not really serving them very well, because you're taught in these quite directive ways how to deal with anger and all these sorts of things. And actually what ends up happening is you end up in a sort of emotional psychological collision course with your own clients a lot of the time, because just telling them again and again, well, you need to fill in this for me, because if you don't, then the judge is going to be angry, etc., that often doesn't really work so well. So teaching these kind of more roundabout ways of working with the resistance, psychologically infused ways of working with people who are vulnerable or who might be suicidal, all of this stuff became more and more important as the pandemic went on. And unfortunately, more and more lawyers and professionals, particularly in the family law world, were finding themselves in situations where clients were in a really desperate state. And it was no longer an option to say, oh, I don't deal with any of the emotional stuff because I'm a lawyer, because you were having to deal with the emotional stuff. And I think this is a really interesting subject, actually, around what is the remit of lawyers and how far does it stray into the sort of psychological. Because in the family law world, what's been really interesting is over the past sort of 10 or so years, particularly, I would say, is we've got much better at including in the processes therapists, family consultants, bringing in people, coaches, divorce coaches, those sorts of people, bringing in people to the process to help clients with the emotional side. The issue that I'm trying to deal with is the fact that with all of those things in mind, all of those developments in mind, which have been very positive, there are still lots of clients who still lean on their lawyers for emotional aspects. And I think, I was thinking about this the other day, lawyers, solicitors, barristers have tended to see themselves as sort of equivalent to surgeons, if we think about the medical world. So we just deal with the actual technical aspects of the work. Have thought to themselves, no, we don't need to do the rest of it. We can outsource that to therapists and the like. When actually, I think clients see us as GPs. They see us as the person who's there, who is there to provide a sort of multitude of services. So I don't think it is an option to say, I don't deal with any of the emotional stuff. I don't deal with any of the psychological stuff, because it finds its way into the work anyway. It's infused, it's in the work, it runs through the work like writing in a stick of rock. I think, particularly for solicitors, I don't think it's an option to say, I'm not going to deal with the psychological stuff, I'm going to outsource that to somebody else. That's not to say that what I do is training lawyers to become therapists. What I do is train people to understand how to have conversations well with people, what things are helpful to say if someone is suffering with their mental health, what is best avoided. And everyone has a different level of appetite for this stuff. Most of the time when we deliver training, for example, we've been asked to do so by a firm, and you have people coming along who are receptive to it, or people who come to us for therapy, lawyers who come to us for therapy, they are receptive to it. But there are quite a lot of situations where we are asked to deliver training to firms, and sometimes those firms make the training compulsory. We've all heard, the awful stories and situations that arise around lawyers and their mental health, particularly in recent years. So sometimes I'll go into firms and deliver training, and everybody has been told to come along. And when that happens, we can have quite an interesting discussion about what is the remit of the lawyer, how far does it stretch, and at what point do we need to signpost off to other organisations and other agencies. I just come back to that sort of maxim that members of the medical profession use, which is that idea of do no harm. And my point is, if you understand some of these skills and some of these techniques for working with people well, then it makes it less likely that you will do harm in the way that you practice.
I wholeheartedly get the debate around the remit of the lawyer. It's kind of the line of questioning there. A couple of things really sort of come out of what you've said. First is, this simply isn't being instilled at the point at which people engage with their initial training, though, is it? It's not covered at law school. It's not particularly covered in traditional routes into law. I mean, SQE won't cover it either, for example. Do you think it should be something that we cover at an earlier stage in the training process?
Yeah, absolutely. This is somewhere where I think America is ahead of the game, as it often is. I was reading a book at the weekend, which was mainly contributed to by American and Canadian legal practitioners, called Trauma Informed Law. And what that book talks about a lot, and what I think about a lot, is making the training from day one more relational, in the sense of, yes, you need to learn about the law and the technicalities and all of that stuff, but really learning those kind of client handling skills of, how to have conversations with people, how to, once you've explained a tricky point of law to somebody, to a client, saying, okay, how does that sit with you? How are you feeling about that? What have you understood from what I've said? What are you taking away from that? Creating this kind of atmosphere, which is more collaborative with a sort of small c from the start, helps to educate clients about actually what's going to happen in the family law process. Because if we set things up as, I'm the lawyer, I'm going to give you all of my wisdom about what's going to happen at court, what order we're going to try and get, and this is what's going to happen, and I'm the expert dispensing wisdom to you, and you're just a receptacle to take that in, then we're giving our clients the wrong impression, actually, about what's likely to happen. Because actually, when you think about the family law processes these days, most of the solutions, in inverted commas, are relational. Judges are saying you need to go to mediation, you need to have roundtable meetings and negotiations, you need to work it out between yourselves, because the courts don't have space to deal with your issues. If we, as the lawyers and as law students, and particularly law students who are going into family law, can learn to work with the material in a more relational way, in the way that we speak to clients, but also having regular intervals to reflect on what we're doing and the impact on ourselves, then we're in a better position to really show clients how this process is likely to go. That it isn't likely you're going to get a final order that's going to solve all of your problems if it's a children matter, for example, because all practitioners have been in a position where you get a final order in relation to children, and then it's not abided by, and then you're sort of chasing someone to try and get them to comply with an order, and that's a very difficult situation to be in. So yeah, I think actually the key is to show law students from the start, particularly those who are going into these more human areas of law, like family, like wills and probate, like trust, that the future is going to be a bit more relational rather than transactional, I would say.
I like that thought. Can I ask you, you mentioned about the fact that family law in particular has started to bring in greater expertise. There's a recognition that perhaps the family lawyer isn't the best person to talk about pensions, for example, or whatever it might be. Would you describe what you're doing as complementary to this, what is known as collaborative law, or is it sort of, does it sit outside of that? Where do you sort of feel as though you sit there?
Vacancy Legal Recruitment, a refreshingly unique and personal talent agency developed specifically for legal. Dedicated to the sector and with extensive experience working across legal services and legal technology, we bridge the gap between your requirements and top-tier legal talent. Get in touch today and say hello at vacancy.co.uk.
I think it's complementary. I do really believe in team working and bringing teams together and having experts who know their stuff and who can help and who can explain things, who break things down in a kind of simplified way and explain things in a way which is kind of accessible to people who are often stressed and distressed and sometimes traumatized. So I think it is complementary. It's interesting for me because I often present and train to collaborative pods, for example. You find that some of the skills that I teach and train in are very complementary to their way of thinking already. Mediators and people who've trained in collaborative law, they've trained in the rudimentary aspects of therapy anyway, in a very kind of small sense. And what I do just takes it a little bit further, I think, for lots of them, and brings in influences like motivational interviewing, for example, is a therapeutic school which has really helpful techniques for working with clients who are resistant, clients with addiction issues. And so it takes things a little bit further, I think, for lots of family law practitioners who are psychologically minded anyway, and people who've trained to be therapeutic supervisors as well. People really are kind of crying out for this stuff and really find that it adds more tools to their toolkit, which is really helpful.
So you've launched the book, Annmarie, as I say, Staying Sane in Family Law. Tell us where the kind of background to writing the book came from. Obviously your own practice, but why is now the right time to put down on paper this mantra that you have?
Depending on when you ask me, I would either say that this book is 7 years in the making or 6 months in the making. Over the past kind of however many years, I've been writing columns for various kind of magazines and publications and writing things on LinkedIn. And it all sort of started to kind of coalesce in my mind last year. And what I wanted to do is write something that is very much in the way that I write on social media, for example, which is very accessible, quite funny, all the information, all the practical tools that I think people working in family law need to have, all those psychologically informed tools, but which is infused with real life stories from my own life, my wonky, messy life, as I like to kind of refer to it. That's how I train people. And that's the kind of book that I wanted to write, because I feel very passionately that people working in this world have very little time to do additional reading. And unfortunately, a lot of the textbooks that you find, that they're quite dry and quite kind of staid and a little bit boring in some places. So I really wanted to write something that was very accessible, funny, but also credible and gives you practical tips. So the book is basically divided into 2 parts. The first half of the book is the sort of subtitle is Law and Life. So it's about all of the different things that we encounter in our work as family law practitioners. So whether that's working with addiction, whether it's working with neurodiversity, working with mental health disorders, and becoming a more trauma-informed practitioner, all those sorts of things. And there are case studies in most of the chapters. So case studies from the perspective of a mediator, case studies from the perspective of a financial neutral, a barrister, a solicitor, and they bring out some of these themes, some of these kind of pitfalls to avoid, and how to avoid time vampires, boundary bashers, all of this kind of thing. It's very, very practical. The second half of the book is called kind of Coping with Strife, which is about then really drilling down to practical therapeutic techniques that I find really work for practitioners I work with in therapy, to help them cope on a practical level with the difficulties that arise. So there's lots of visuals, lots of graphics. It's a bit like a workbook, actually. You can work through various exercises. There are lots of quizzes to give you ideas for how to cope psychologically with all of the material that you're taking on, how to cope with intrusive thoughts, vicarious trauma, that kind of stuff. So it's very accessible, and it's supposed to be a fun read as well.
You're going to have to tell the listeners what on earth a boundary basher is.
A boundary basher? Well, anyone in family law knows that boundaries are incredibly difficult to keep within family law, because it's all very well, when you're going through law school, to say, well, when I'm practicing as a lawyer or another practitioner, I'm going to protect my boundaries by logging off at 5:30 every day and going to yoga. And then you're faced with the reality of practice, which is you're dealing with people in states of high distress. They have a tendency to be highly reactive, to bombard you with emails. Sometimes you're dealing with people who are very traumatized and vulnerable, who just have a great way of keeping you on the phone for long periods of time. And it's very, very difficult to actually cut those people off, because lots of us, or most of us, I would say, who come into this area of law do so because we are empathetic people. We want to help people. We are natural people pleasers, I would say. We are naturally predisposed to put other people's needs and wants before our own. And we are also, I would say, very, very prone to feelings of guilt. Contrary to this idea of fat cat lawyers who don't care about anyone. Family law practitioners are absolutely not like that at all, if that cliche is even true for any lawyers, but particularly family lawyers and other practitioners in this world. We feel the pain that we're exposed to very, very deeply. And I think, back in the day, we used to say to practitioners, you need to grow a thicker skin, you need to be less sensitive, etc., etc. I think what we've seen in recent years is that approach didn't work, actually, because you are taking on these feelings, whether you know it or not, and often people's coping mechanisms were a bit wonky. The feelings, we were taking on the feelings, but they ended up coming out sideways. So lots of practitioners ended up, with addiction issues, difficulties at home, not knowing how to cope with things. So really, my point is, yes, there is a space for compartmentalizing, and we all have to do that, space for sort of containing feelings. But really, we all need an outlet to deal with these difficult feelings that we take on. Being more kind of real about what it is that we take on, I think, is important. Having a space in reflective practice or therapeutic supervision is really important. And being able to have a look at how the material that we take on through our client work intersects with our own vulnerabilities and idiosyncrasies through some of the techniques that I have included in the book. It is a great way of having a little kind of pressure release. As I say, there's lots of quizzes, activities, worksheets to look at, which help you to process some of the emotional and psychological difficulties of the work.
As I'm listening to what you're saying, with my wider publication hat on, and listeners to the Today's Family Lawyer podcast may be aware, we have two sister publications, one in wills and probate, one in conveyancing, all dealing with the legal community. I think what you do has a much wider application as well, doesn't it, Annmarie? We're not just talking, although you're talking quite specifically about family lawyers, that compartmentalization, that ability to relate to clients, particularly, you take wills and probate as an example where you're dealing with death on a daily basis. I've done podcasts in the past with professionals who've kind of talked about the way they cope and the way they manage those emotions. And yeah, they've said, actually, you can't but take it home with you from time to time. So it's absolutely got more relevance to the wider legal sector than just family.
Yeah, absolutely. And at TCC, we work with lawyers and other professionals from across different practice areas, but we have quite a few clients who are in the wills and probate world, for example, where, as you say, I find it sort of ludicrous, really, that we're kind of lagging behind in the legal world in terms of recognizing the impact on wills and probate practitioners, personal injury lawyers, clinical negligence lawyers, immigration lawyers, criminal lawyers. Increasingly, at the training events I put on, we always have a sort of smattering of practitioners from those areas as well. And we're starting to work with a lot of injury lawyers on a more regular basis. I have a medical negligence lawyer who's now a therapist joining our agency in September, because actually, in family law, we've been sort of slightly leading the way in terms of acknowledging the existence of vicarious trauma and the strength of emotions and the impact that has on us. But I think, there are lots of lawyers who are dealing with this kind of distressing material every day, but are still being told, oh, you just need to grow a thicker skin, develop more resilience, etc., etc. Personally, my view of resilience is there are lots of different forms of resilience. Some people who might appear resilient are actually quite kind of dissociated from their feelings. And actually, that might not be very helpful in terms of a quality for a lawyer or other professional to have, because if you are dissociated from your own feelings, you are going to be less able to pick up on the signals from your client, you're going to be less attuned to your client's emotions. And actually that's quite difficult. That's not necessarily a trait that we want to have. We want to be able to pick up on things that our clients aren't telling us, for example, around domestic abuse. We know these days, don't we, that domestic abuse can take forms which are much more subtle than we used to recognize. And so it's not always going to be the case that your client's going to come in and say, yes, my husband or wife is abusing me, and to sort of spill all that information. Often it will manifest in more subtle ways. And if you're not attuned as a practitioner to your feelings, to their feelings, to what's going on, you might miss that. And so we want our practitioners to be attuned. We also want them to have resilience and to be able to function. And I think that's what I'm trying to sort of help people to do, which is to understand the deeper dynamics that are going on and to be able to look after themselves. But it goes much further than telling people to have a thicker skin. I don't think that works at all.
One of the things that we've touched on in the conveyancing podcast, as an example, is that happier, healthier workforce, they make fewer mistakes.
I think that's absolutely true. And also there's a really important point about psychological safety, isn't there? So I was talking with a colleague this morning as we're developing our neurodiversity training about how we help clients to feel psychologically safe. Because if your client feels psychologically safe in the meeting room with you, then their executive functioning is able to come online. Their logical, analytical thinking, to put it boldly, like, you're able to get better results because they're not terrified and kind of flooded with feelings. And that applies to practitioners as well, doesn't it? There are lots of lawyers and other professionals, particularly at the more junior end, who might be sat listening to this in law firms, feeling terrified of making a mistake, feeling worried about, oh, I can't call this client because they're going to be angry with me, or my supervisor's going to be angry with me because I've not done this right, or I've got 70 conveyancing files, I don't know how I'm going to get through them all, I'm stressed out. When we're in that state, we are not able to think analytically and logically and to use all of the amazing capacity of our brains. So what we're trying to do in learning these kind of soothing techniques for our clients and also for ourselves is to develop a more effective workforce and more effective ways of working with our clients.
And we were chatting just before we started the recording. Actually, the impact on your home life is as important, and even more so than pre-pandemic are our working and home lives intertwined. I mean, you and I are both chatting to one another. You're sat at home, I'm sat at home. I've got the kids off. We're recording this during the summer holidays. I've got the kids off. You've got the kids off. Our lives, our working and personal lives are so much more intertwined than they ever used to be.
It's so true. And one thing I've really noticed about the professionals that I work with is we are able to keep functioning in our professional lives to a high level for a long, long time, when other people might have burnt out months and months before. But what often happens is we appear to be kind of doing really, really well at work and keeping it all together. And then at home, we feel like a kind of hollowed out shell, and we're having problems at home, and we've got nothing left to give at home. I see lots of people who end up in that position, and I can relate to it myself. Being a therapist is really, you take on a huge amount of emotion, and then, I can be the best therapist in the world, and then I can go and kind of have a go at my husband because he's overcooked the noodles. I often kind of talk about this. I think it's really important that we recognise that the impact on home life, and also the cumulative effect of the stress that we take on, which we're often not aware of until later on. A lot of people come to me and say, why am I feeling terrible at this point? Actually, everything's going okay. And when we track back, we see that they had a difficulty at home or a bereavement in their extended family 6 months before, and a year ago they had problems with their spouse, and they had a really difficult client 18 months before that. And it's the cumulative effect, it's the drip, drip, drip effect. And then often they will end up feeling terrible at a point which they did not expect to feel terrible. So there's often a delayed reaction. There's often displaced reactions to stress. I often joke about, you can tell how I am doing emotionally by how I drive. When I get in the car, if I'm getting angry with everyone on the road, or racing to school pickup and looking, completely stressed out of my mind, then you know what's going on with me. Whereas 10 minutes before, I might have been the best therapist in the world for my client. But, you often see, don't you, how you really are by what comes out in your personal life.
We are fast running out of time for the podcast. I've really enjoyed chatting and hearing about the techniques that you've kind of talked about and the importance of this. I still really struggle with that balance between the role of the practitioner and the role that they might have. And we recognize they have a sort of emotionally supportive role, but at the same time they've got to do right by their clients. Final thing I wanted to touch on, Annmarie, and perhaps we should have talked about this earlier in the discussion, but what I sense and see actually in the profession is a real kind of professionalism developing in organizations like yourself, where you bring a lot of qualifications, you bring a lot of credibility to this. We take the examples of divorce coaches, and I've had a number on the podcast. The level of training that has gone into them, this isn't somebody who's had a really bad experience and thought to themselves, you know what, I think I could support somebody through this in a better way than I was. You've actually gone and you've got some really heavy hitting qualifications to enable you to go and do this, haven't you?
Yeah, and it's something I feel very passionately about, is the importance of having that therapeutic qualification. So like I said at the start, I was a solicitor and mediator for over 10 years, and then I spent 4 years retraining to become a therapist. And then, as with lawyers, really, therapists undertake ongoing CPD and ongoing training to keep us up to speed, really, with developments, because things are developing all the time, really. Guidance around working well with people who are suicidal, for example, it evolves all the time, so it's important to keep up to date with that. But I think the reason why my training is popular is because I come at it from having done the job myself and now coming at it from a therapeutic standpoint, because what it means is I always am really passionate about including practical tips that I know actually help in time-pressured circumstances, because the therapeutic theory is really interesting and fascinating, but unless you can accompany it with ideas and techniques that work for people in time-pressured circumstances, it's not going to help lawyers, and they're not going to listen, basically. Just to finish on that point of the role of the lawyer, I do think we are at a very interesting juncture, because we have the one couple, one lawyer model, which is now becoming popular. We're a couple of years into that. We also have problem-solving courts, pathfinder courts, the family drug and alcohol court, and other problem-solving courts, which take this more therapeutic approach. And there's this concept of therapeutic jurisprudence as well, this idea that we can no longer say there's a clear dividing line between law and technicality and taking a more psychologically informed approach. And so I believe we're going to see more and more of that as time goes on, and this idea that, okay, if we're going to make our courts and our systems and our processes more trauma informed, more psychologically informed, then we have to train up our practitioners in this. And we see judges who are interested in this, and all sorts of people from different angles of the profession. So it's an interesting time for family law.
Well, no arguments here. It's been great to have you on the podcast. We have run out of time, Annmarie. The book is available now, isn't it, on the Bath Publishing website?
Yeah, absolutely. Please go out and buy it.
The Today's Family Lawyer podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on todaysfamilylawyer.co.uk. My thanks to Annmarie. Thank you as ever for listening, and we'll see you again soon.
You're listening to the Today's Family Lawyer podcast, the leading source of daily news and insight for family law practitioners in England and Wales. Sign up to our free weekly newsletter at todaysfamilylawyer.co.uk and subscribe to hear all the latest news and views from across the family law sector. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.